Montana Territory, spring of 1879. The wind howled across the open plains like it was carrying a warning, but it wasn't strong enough to drown out the sound of the whip cracking through the still morning air. Tessa Langford staggered forward, her palms braced against the cold iron bars of the cattle pen. Her back burned where the leather had struck, but she would not cry. She would not give them that. "You'll say yes next time," barked the foreman, a squat man with yellow teeth and a voice like gravel. He dropped the whip to his side and spat into the dirt. "You work for Mr. Carrington now. You don't get the luxury of refusing." Tessa didn't speak. She kept her head bowed, her breath shallow, her jaw locked. Her wrists were raw from the rope they had used to drag her out here. She had refused to cook for the men without being paid, refused to let Carrington's son put his hands on her after dark. Pain was the price, and she had paid it. She would have collapsed if not for the small, trembling hands gripping hers. "Are you okay, Mama?" whispered her son Jameson, barely 9, his blue eyes wide and wet. She turned to him, brushing the hair from his forehead with shaking fingers. "I am still standing, baby." That's what matters. Beside him, his sister Josie, 7, clung to her brother's arm, silent and scared. Tessa had lost everything the year before her husband to fever, her little homestead to fire. Carrington's ranch had been the only place that would take a widow with 2 children. She should have known better. "You keep defying me, I'll start with the boy next," Carrington growled from the porch, watching with narrowed eyes. "Do not make me teach him what it means to obey." She stood up straighter, shielding her children with her body. "Touch them and I will kill you where you stand." Carrington only laughed, but someone else did not. A voice cut through the wind, low, even, and dangerous. "That's enough." Everyone turned to see the stranger on horseback, a dust-covered man with a rifle slung across his saddle and a look in his eyes like he had seen hell and come walking back from it. He dismounted slow, steady, his boots crunching against the dry earth. His coat was worn, the edges stained from long rides and longer nights, and a trail of horse sweat ran down his mare's flank. The foreman stepped forward, confused. "Who the hell are you?" "Name's Yates Lorne," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "And what I just saw was a man whipping a woman for saying no. That does not sit right with me." "You ain't got no say here," Carrington growled, stepping down from the porch. Yates stopped a few paces from Tessa and the children. He looked at her, really looked at her, and his jaw clenched. "You never have to say yes to pain again," he said quietly, but loud enough for her to hear. Tessa stared at him, not understanding. Carrington laughed again. "You one of those drifters who thinks he can play hero?" Yates dropped his rifle to the ground and stepped forward. "You want to raise a hand to someone, try me." Carrington was many things, but he was not a fool. He looked at the rifle, then at the man who just dared him. Yates stood like he had been in fights where men did not walk away. He had the look of someone who had already lost too much and had nothing left to be afraid of. Carrington backed off, spitting in the dirt. "They ain't worth the trouble anyway. Let them go. I got a dozen others who'll work for less." A minute later, Tessa stood with her children, her wrists still bound, watching as Yates picked up his rifle and turned to her. "You have a place to go?" he asked. She hesitated. "We had a wagon, but the wheels broke." "We were headed north." "Then you are coming with me," he said. "There is an old trapper's cabin a few miles east. It is mine now, no one there but me and the mountain air." Tessa looked down at her children. Josie nodded quickly. Jameson grabbed her hand. "You saved us," Tessa said, her voice low. "I just hate cowards," Yates replied. They left behind the ranch in the pain, riding double on his mare while the sun climbed over the hills. Josie sat in front, Jameson behind, and Tessa clung to Yates because there was nowhere else to hold on. The cabin was small but clean. A single room with a stove, a cot, and a table. Yates set the children to warming near the fire, then gently cut the ropes from Tessa's wrists, his fingers careful not to press too hard on her bruised skin. "You got names?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "Tessa Langford." "These are my children, Josie and Jameson." Yates nodded. "The stove works. You can rest here. I will sleep in the barn." She looked up at him, surprised. "Why are you helping us?" He shrugged. "Because someone should have helped you a long time ago." That night, while the children slept curled up in the bedroll he gave them, Tessa sat by the fire, her arms wrapped tight around herself. Yates handed her a tin cup of water and sat across from her. "I do not know how to repay you," she said. "You do not owe me anything," he replied. She studied his face. The lines around his mouth were deep, like he had frowned more than he smiled. His eyes were tired but not cold. He looked like a man who had seen pain of his own. "You were in the war?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "Union cavalry, lost my brother in Tennessee, then I lost my home after, been drifting since." She said nothing, just stared into the fire. Then, without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand. He did not flinch. "Thank you," she said. His eyes met hers. "You and your kids are safe now, I will make sure of that." And for the first time in what felt like years, Tessa believed it. The snow had melted off the high ridges by the time Tessa opened the cabin door the next morning, and the air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. Josie and Jameson were still asleep, curled close under the blanket Yates had given them. She stepped outside quietly, her hands wrapped around the wool shawl she'd found folded near the stove. Yates was a few yards from the barn, knee-deep in the stream that ran through the edge of the clearing. He was cutting branches from a fallen ash, stacking them in even lengths. His sleeves were rolled past his elbows, revealing pale scars that crossed his forearms like old rivers. "You work early," she said, his head lifted, but he didn't pause. "Storm's coming from the west." Felt it in the air before the sun rose. Best to have dry wood in before it hits. She watched him break another branch across his knee. "You always read the weather like that." "I had to. Too many miles between one shelter and the next." He set the branch aside and looked up at her. "Did your children eat last night?" "They did. Thank you for the bread." "I'll set snares later. Rabbit moves fast in the thaw. I'll teach your boy to check them if he wants to learn." Her voice softened. "He'll want that. He's been trying to act grown for too long." Yates nodded once, then returned to the branches. Tessa hesitated, then stepped down into the yard. "I can help with the chopping," she said. "My hands still work." He didn't argue. He simply handed her a hatchet from the stump and moved aside. She took it without flinching and began splitting the smaller limbs. The rhythm was familiar, and in it she found something steadying. After an hour, she paused and brushed her hair from her face. "You said this was a trapper's cabin. Was it yours back then?" "No. Belonged to an old man named Calhoun. I met him in Helena years ago. He gave me the deed before he died, said he didn't want Carrington's men getting a hold of it." "So you knew Carrington before?" "I knew what kind of man he was." She looked down at the wood between them. "Why stay close then?" Yates leaned against a pine. "Sometimes you stay where the worst things happened, not because you like it, but because you're not ready to leave." She didn't respond, not right away. Then she said, "I thought I'd find peace after my husband passed. Not because I didn't love him, I did, but because I thought the worst was behind us. Turns out, peace isn't something that just shows up because you've had your share of pain." "No," Yates said quietly, "it has to be built. And it don't come cheap." She nodded once, then turned to gather the split wood. He watched her for a moment, then moved to help without a word. By midday, the clouds had thickened. Josie helped fold the linens inside while Jameson followed Yates into the wooded rise behind the cabin. Tessa stayed on the porch, sewing up a tear in her son's shirt. When the two returned, Jameson's cheeks were flushed and his hands smelled of pine sap. He held up a small rabbit, proud. "Mr. Lorne showed me how to set a loop right under the brush." "It worked," Tessa smiled, her fingers stilling on the fabric. "That's good, sweetheart." Yates stepped up behind the boy and gently rested a hand on his shoulder. "He listens well, got a sharp eye." After supper, they sat outside on the porch steps. Josie rested against her mother's side, asleep, while Jameson dozed nearby with his head on a rolled shirt. Yates sat a little distance off, his rifle across his knees, not out of fear but habit. The lantern beside them cast a soft glow, and the wind had gone still. "You were right about the storm," Tessa said. He nodded, his gaze toward the trees. "It'll be here by morning." She pulled the shawl tighter and studied him in the dim light. "You're not like most men I've known." "I don't know if that's good or bad." "It's good," she said. "But it makes me wonder what broke you." He turned his head, not startled, just quiet. A woman once asked me that same thing a long time ago. What did you tell her? He looked at the children. I told her I wasn't broken. Just bent in places that don't straighten out again. Tessa didn't speak for a long while. Then she said, "Bent still holds." Yates looked at her, then nodded once. Inside, the fire burned low. Tessa rose and gathered her children in her arms, carrying Josie and guiding Jameson to their bedroll. Before she stepped inside, she looked back at Yates. "Thank you," she said, "for letting us take up space here." "You don't take up space," he said. "You belong here as long as you need." She let the door close behind her, and for the first time in months, she locked it not from fear but to keep the warmth in. 2 weeks passed before the storm lifted. Snow fell heavy and wet, sealing them in the cabin with nothing but the low howl of wind and the slow crackle of firewood to mark the hours. Tessa kept her hands busy mending seams and stitching patches, while Yates worked at carving pegs and shaping new handles for tools too long neglected. They moved around each other without friction, like two people who understood the value of quiet. By the time the thaw reached the valley, the creek was running high, and the ground had softened to mud thick enough to suck the boots clean off a man. Yates pulled the mare from her lean-to and began brushing out her coat. Jameson stood nearby, watching every motion. Josie sat cross-legged by the porch steps with a wooden spoon she'd been sanding smooth. Tessa came from the woodshed carrying a bundle of saplings, her sleeves rolled to the elbows and her braid pulled tight to the nape of her neck. She laid the bundle near Yates without needing to speak. "That'll do for fence posts," he said, straightening. "You've got an eye for strong wood." "I was raised on barley acres. My father didn't let us near a horse until we could tell pine from spruce by the bark." He gave a slow nod. "You ever think about planting again?" "I've thought about it," she said. "But thinking doesn't grow anything." Yates looked out toward the field beyond the creek. "The earth here's good, you could coax plenty out of it." Tessa followed his gaze, her voice low. "We'd need furrows cut, seeds, tools better than what's in that shed. I've got a plow blade. Needs a new yoke, but it'll pull straight." She narrowed her eyes. "And you'd just lend it?" "I'd help you use it." He turned back to the mare and didn't look at her again, but the air between them held something unspoken and steady. That night, after the children had fallen asleep near the hearth, Tessa stepped out into the yard. The moon was low and full, casting pale light across the snow-packed shadows. Yates was sitting on an overturned bucket near the barn, sharpening a drawknife with long, even strokes. "You don't ask much," she said, folding her arms to keep out the cold. "I've never been good at asking." She leaned against the post beside him. "That why you live out here alone?" He didn't answer right away. "I tried settling once. After the war, there was a woman, she waited. Her father ran cattle outside of Abilene. I was hired on to help break horses. Thought maybe I could belong there, but her family didn't take kindly to the idea. You loved her." "I thought I did, but I think maybe I was more in love with the idea of peace." Tessa was quiet for a long while. "I married young, 17. My husband didn't talk much, but he was kind, gave me this shawl on our first winter together, said he didn't want me going cold even if he couldn't always keep the fire lit." Yates set the drawknife aside. "You miss him, most days," she said. "But not all in the same way." He nodded once. "Grief's a crooked thing, never walks in a straight line." She stepped closer, her boots crunching against the frost. "I think I'd like to try planting this spring, if the ground will let me." His voice was low. "It will. I can't do it alone." "You won't have to." She looked up at him. His face was mostly shadow, but the set of his shoulders had softened. She reached out and touched his hand, not for warmth, but to see if he'd let her. He didn't pull away. Inside, the stove ticked as the coals settled. Josie stirred and rolled over, her arm flung across her brother's chest. Tessa let her hand rest in his for another moment before she drew back. "I should turn in. The children wake early." He stood when she did. "I'll check the snares again tomorrow. Might be something worth cooking." She nodded and stepped toward the door. Before she reached it, she turned back. "Thank you," she said, "not just for the roof, for letting us be more than what happened to us." He didn't move, but his words were clear. "You were always more. You just needed space to remember it." She went inside without another word, but her chest felt lighter. Outside, Yates sat again, the drawknife forgotten beside him, and watched the sky turn silver above the trees. By late March, the soil had darkened beneath the sun's steady touch, and the scent of thawed loam drifted through the clearing like the promise of something clean and growing. Tessa stood knee-deep in the field beyond the stream, her skirts hitched above her boots, sleeves rolled, fingers sunk into the earth. She pressed a seed into the wet furrow, the motion patient and careful, like laying down hope. Yates was ahead of her, guiding the plow with slow, deliberate steps while the mare strained against the harness. Jameson walked beside the blade, tossing aside stones too thick to break. Josie sat on a rock at the edge of the field, humming softly as she carved a whistle from willow bark with the small penknife Yates had given her, under her mother's watchful eye. Tessa wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Did you ever plant anything before this?" "Corn, once," Yates said without looking back. "In Missouri, before they called for volunteers, it never came up. Soil was too thin and I didn't know what I was doing." "Well," she said, kneeling again, "you're doing better now." He glanced over his shoulder, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. "Maybe I needed better company." By afternoon, they'd finished the row and laid down the last of the seed. Tessa straightened, rubbing her palms together, and looked out over the field. The furrows wove through the earth like stitched cloth, uneven in places but honest. She felt the ache in her back, but it was a clean ache earned. Later, as the sun leaned westward, she stood at the washbasin near the porch, rinsing dirt from her arms. Yates came around the corner, carrying a bundle wrapped in oilskin. "Found this in the cabin loft," he said, placing it on the table. "Belonged to the old trapper, thought you might make use of it." She unwrapped the cloth carefully. Inside were 3 bundles of dyed quilting scraps, a half-used spool of thread, and a pair of iron scissors dulled with time. Her fingers hovered over the fabric. "These'll do just fine." Josie's coat's nearly threadbare at the elbows. Yates leaned against the porch rail. "You ever sew for trade?" "Back in Kansas, I used to take in mending for the town doctor's wife. She'd send me her husband's shirts with tears under the arms. He never would stop reaching too far for things." He smiled faintly. "You think you'd do it again, taking work like that?" "If we're staying," she said, her tone even, "then we'll need ways to keep fed come winter. And I won't let the children go cold again." "You're staying then?" She dried her hands on her apron, then nodded. "If you'll have us." "I'd be a fool not to." The porch creaked as she stepped closer. "You've never asked me what I want beyond the next day." "You just wait till I say it." "I figure you've had enough of men deciding for you." She was quiet, then said, "I want to make Josie a dress that fits. I want Jameson to know what it feels like to bring in a harvest. I want to wake up and not wonder what comes next." Her voice caught just barely. "And I want to do it here." Yates's voice was low. "Then we'll do it here." That night, while the children slept beneath patched quilts, Tessa sat near the fire, sorting through the fabric scraps. Yates sat across from her, sharpening the edge of a rusted hoe they'd found in the shed earlier that day. She didn't look up as she asked, "Do you ever think about what your life might have looked like if the war hadn't come?" "I used to," he said, testing the blade with his thumb. "But the thing about wondering is, it don't change much. Only thing it's ever done is keep me up at night." She met his eyes then. "What keeps you up now?" He set the tool aside. "Mostly the thought of you packing up and leaving." "I'm not going, I know," he said. Then, after a beat, "But I still think about it." She set the fabric down and crossed to sit beside him, not too close, but close enough. "I don't scare off easy," she said. "I don't push easy neither." They sat like that for a long time, the firelight softening the shadows between them. Outside, the wind had gone still, and the faint hoot of an owl echoed from the far trees. Tessa laid her hand on his knee, just enough to feel the warmth through the worn denim. "I never expected to feel safe again," she whispered. "But I do." Yates didn't speak, only turned his hand over to hold hers. Their fingers stayed laced together until the fire burned low and the night folded in around the quiet. The 1st of May brought yellow wildflowers along the edge of the stream and a quiet warmth that settled into Tessa's shoulders as she hung linens on the line. The air smelled of thawed bark and the faint sweetness of sap rising in the trees. Josie was helping near the stump, carefully folding the dry cloths as her mother passed them down. Jameson was off with Yates, walking the fence line with a coil of wire and a hammer. Tessa watched the two figures moving across the slope, slow, deliberate, with Jameson trailing a step behind, mimicking the way Yates paused to inspect posts. She hadn't asked Yates to take the boy under his wing, he'd started doing it on his own. And Jameson had started walking a little taller because of it. Josie looked up. "Mama, do you think we'll always live here?" Tessa crouched beside her. "Why do you ask?" "Because I like it here," Josie said, folding the last towel into a square. "And I don't want to go somewhere else and start over again." Tessa brushed a bit of lint from her daughter's collar. "We're not going anywhere." Josie turned her face into her mother's neck and stayed there a moment longer than usual. By the time Yates and Jameson returned, the sun had dipped behind the ridge and the wind had cooled. Yates set the hammer on the porch rail, dusted his hands, and looked toward the smoke curling from the chimney. Tessa met him at the steps. "Fence holding, mostly. South end's leaning, but it'll hold through planting. I'll reinforce it before the summer rains." She reached out and touched the dirt smudge near his temple with her thumb. "You've got a bit of the mountain on your face." He caught her wrist gently. "You've got it on yours, too." Neither of them moved for a while. That evening, Jameson showed his sister how to whittle the bark from a peeled stick, and Tessa spooned stew into tin bowls while Yates mended the handle of a kettle that had cracked near the rim. After the children had gone to sleep, Yates stepped back inside from the porch where he'd been watching the moonlight stretch over the grass. "I've been thinking," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "About the two of you, about this place." Tessa turned from the stove. "What about us?" "I've lived in this valley near on 3 years now," he said. "Built habits around silence and ash, but I've come to like the sound of Josie's voice in the morning, and the way Jameson asks questions I don't always know how to answer, and you," he stopped, swallowed once. "I wake up thinking about you, and I go to sleep wondering if you'll still be here when I open my eyes again." Tessa stepped to him slowly, her voice low. "You don't have to wonder." He looked down at her, and for a long time neither of them said a word. Then she lifted her hand and touched his chest, just over the place his heart beat steady beneath the fabric. "I've lost a husband before," she said. "I never thought I'd love someone again, but I do." Yates's breath caught in his throat. He raised his hand and placed it over hers. "I've never had a woman choose me, not fully, not without condition." "You've got no conditions here," she said. "Just us, just this." He kissed her then, not urgent, but with the quiet certainty of a man who'd waited long enough to know what mattered. Her arms came around him, and they stood there in the soft candlelight, the floor creaking beneath them as the wind brushed the windows. They made their home together after that, not by declaration, but by rhythm. Yates moved his tools into the cabin's back wall, where he built a shelf to store her thread and needles. She taught Josie to hem straight seams, and Yates taught Jameson to read the stars by name. The field came up strong, the first sprouts of barley lifting shy green blades toward the sky. By the time the first frost returned, they had a smokehouse full of meat and a root cellar lined with jars. Tessa made a new quilt from the trapper's old scraps, and Josie stitched her name into the corner. Jameson built a birdhouse from pine offcuts and nailed it to the side of the barn. The preacher from Bozeman came through riding circuit in early November. He married them under the cottonwoods, with the children standing beside them and the creek running low behind the house. Tessa wore a dress she'd sewn from muslin, and Yates wore the same shirt he'd worn the day he brought her to the cabin, newly patched by her hand. After the vows, they stood beneath the bare branches, holding each other's hands as the preacher rode off into the trees. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice rough. She smiled. "I'm more sure of you than I've been of anything since my children were born." That night, as they lay in the bed Yates had built with his own hands, she rested her head against his shoulder and listened to the wind outside. "You still afraid I'll leave?" she whispered. He kissed her hair. "No, I ain't afraid of anything anymore." Years passed, slow and full. Josie grew tall and clever, always with a pencil behind her ear and a sketchbook tucked under her arm. Jameson took to raising livestock, and by the time he was 20, he was running a small herd of his own. They built a second cabin in the south field, and Yates helped raise the beams with hands that had once only known how to tear things down. Tessa kept tending the garden, kept sewing when the weather turned, and every evening she and Yates sat on the porch together while the sun slipped behind the ridge. Their life was not loud. It was not easy. But it was theirs, honest and earned, built on the quiet strength of two people who had known loss and chose, anyway, to love, and they never had to run again.